Do not let me fall into tomorrow. Do not let gold become my God. Breath today be enough.
Has you ever noticed how we treat ancient wisdom? Like, there's this deeply ingrained societal habit of taking these 2,000-year-old texts, especially the religious ones, and just sort of sanding down all of their rough edges.
Oh, totally. We sanitize them.
Right. We want them to act like a soothing greeting card. You read a famous passage, something about looking at the birds of the air or the flowers of the field, and the standard modern interpretation just points to it and says, see, just trust the universe, let go. Don't worry, be happy. We just crave that kind of, pastel-colored comfort when we are stressed out about our modern lives.
We do, yeah, because we're desperate for a spiritual balm. I mean, we really want ancient philosophers or religious figures to act as like gentle therapists for us. When you're drowning in the modern gig economy, or you're terrified about a looming market crash, or just agonizing over a massive medical bill, a pastoral, poetic reassurance feels like a brief respite. But the problem with reading these texts as mere poetry or comforting devotional sentiment is that it completely neuters the actual mechanism of what the text is trying to do.
Yeah, it really does.
It basically turns a radical intervention into a cross-stitch pillow.
Which brings us to what we're doing today on this deep dive. Today, we are taking one of those cross-stitch pillows and just ripping it apart to look at the wiring inside. We are diving into a completely unique, fascinating multimedia exhibit that was published on academia.edu on June 21st, 2026.
It's such a wild piece of work.
It really is. The researcher behind this is Wintol Peter Nowak from Melbourne, Australia. And his premise is going to completely upend how you view one of the most famous biblical passages in history, which is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Specifically, we're looking at Matthew chapter 6, verses 24 through 34. This is the famous "Do not be anxious" passage. But Nowak just strips away every single ounce of that Sunday school sentimentality.
Yeah, it is a brutal clinical reframing of the text. Nowak completely refuses to read Jesus' words as a gentle suggestion or a bit of poetic consolation. Instead, he analyzes the passage as a, quote, late corrective intervention.
Oh, wow.
Right? Think of it as a rigid, highly technical set of administrative instructions imposed on a defective human operating system. He essentially reads the Sermon on the Mount the way a systems engineer would read a crisis mitigation protocol.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because reading a first-century religious text through the lens of modern systems engineering is a massive leap. Our goal for you, the listener, is that by the end of this deep dive, you are going to understand how ancient theology, modern psychology, and I am completely serious here, Australian workplace risk management frameworks all intersect.
It sounds absurd, but it makes so much sense when you see it.
It really does. We're going to explore why human beings are so fundamentally wired for anxiety, and what this text claims is the actual structural mechanism for surviving it.
And, to ground us in this completely different perspective, Nowak doesn't start his exhibit with a dry academic thesis. He actually starts with a visual shock to the system. He presents an allegorical painting, which is listed as Figure 1 in his exhibit. It's titled, "Do Not Be Anxious, a modern allegory of Christ, Mammon, and the anxious soul." The genius of this painting is how it violently shatters your visual expectations.
Right, because normally if you hear Sermon on the Mount, you immediately picture a sun-drenched, dusty hillside in ancient Galilee. There are people in robes, maybe some sheep in the background. It's a very safe, distant, historical tableau.
Exactly, but Nowak places the scene in a contemporary therapeutic chamber. It looks like a high-end, slightly sterile, modern office space. Jesus is seated in this room, but he is sitting opposite a stressed, utterly exhausted, modern man who is just slumping back in a leather chair. The man looks like he hasn't slept in a week. He looks completely overwhelmed by his reality.
And the reality surrounding him is what makes the painting so heavy. The room is cluttered, but it's a very specific kind of clutter. It's the symbolic wreckage of modern survival. There's a smartphone resting on a table, and the screen is glowing, clearly demanding attention.
Yeah, the endless notifications.
Exactly. And you have stacks of paper bills, mortgage, rent, utilities. There's a newspaper that looks like it was thrown down in frustration, and the headline just blares the word markets in this Sark heavy type.
But then, right in the middle of this suffocating modern anxiety, you have these jarring intrusions of the ancient text. Outside the window of this high-rise office, you actually see birds flying freely. And blooming right there inside the room, completely out of place against the glowing screens and financial papers, are these beautiful, vibrant lilies. It is a literal physical staging of the elements Jesus mentions in Matthew 6, but dragged, kicking and screaming into the 21st century.
It's brilliant, honestly, because it functions like a collision of two totally incompatible worlds. It's kind of like taking a stoic ancient philosopher and dropping him into the office of a frantic corporate accountant right in the middle of tax season. It forces you to realize that the hazards Jesus was talking about aren't just ancient agricultural problems like hoping it rains so the wheat grows. The hazards are entirely active right now.
They're right in front of us.
Exactly. The threat of eviction, the collapsing stock market, the relentless ping of your email inbox. Those are the modern equivalents of starvation and exposure.
What's fascinating here is that this is the exact tension Nowak is trying to highlight. By putting the Christ figure in the same room as the glowing smartphone and the financial ruin, Nowak illustrates that this passage is not a pastoral pat on the back. It is a clash of absolute authorities. It's the Christic command stepping into a psychological space that is already completely dominated by a brutal, everyday master. And the text gives that master a specific name, which is Mammon.
Let's hold on that word for a second, mammon. We hear that thrown around occasionally, and, people usually just translate it as money or greed, like don't be greedy. But Nowak argues it's much deeper and more insidious than just having a fat bank account, right?
Far deeper. Nowak digs into the linguistics here. He points out that mammon is a Semitic loanword. It literally means wealth, property, or that in which one trusts. But what happens in the text of Matthew 6 is that mammon is explicitly personified. Jesus says you cannot serve God and mammon. He doesn't say you cannot serve God and a pile of coins.
Right, it's an active entity.
Exactly. By personifying it, the text treats Mammon as an active rival master. It is a competing control system that demands your total psychological allegiance. It wakes you up at 3 in the morning. It dictates your mood. It literally tells you what you are worth.
Okay, so if Mammon is a control system, this brings us to how Nowak defines the human being operating under that system. He uses this incredibly clinical phrase, the human requirement satisfaction system.
I have to admit, when I first read that, it sounded like a term pulled straight out of an IT manual, not a theological paper.
It really does, and that vocabulary choice is intensely deliberate. Nowak wants to strip away the spiritual romanticism. He asserts that human beings are born into compulsory conditions that are largely not of their own making. Think about it. You didn't choose your biological needs. You didn't design the hardware you're running on.
Right. You just wake up in a body one day and suddenly you are bombarded with primary inputs. Your stomach signals hunger, your throat signals thirst, you experience fatigue, bodily vulnerability, fluctuating hormones, and you realize very quickly that resources are scarce. And those are just the base biological inputs. Then you add the psychological and sociological inputs. You realize you are mortal. You start comparing yourself to others socially. You face external threats from other humans. And looming over all of this is the massive, paralyzing cloud of future uncertainty. To map out how a human navigates this terrifying landscape, Nowak provides a 4-layer model of our requirements.
Let's walk through that map because it really clarifies how trapped we actually are in this system.
Yeah, so the foundational layer is biology. This is absolute bodily compulsion, the sheer, inescapable logic of physical survival. If you don't eat, you die. The next layer up is sociology. This is where culture, civilization, the economy, debt, and that brutal social comparison exist. You don't just need food, you need to buy food using currency, which requires labor within a societal structure.
And the third layer is virtue. If I understand Nowak correctly, this is our internal governance. It's how we habituate ourselves to control our appetites and our fears. It's the filter that stops us from stealing the food we need or lashing out when we are scared.
Exactly. It's the self-regulatory layer. And then the fourth and final top layer in Nowak's model is grace. He defines this very specifically as divine assistance and provision. This is the non-human participant introduced by Jesus into the system. But before we get to how grace works, we have to understand what happens when the system fails. We have to understand how Nowak defines anxiety.
Because usually, if you ask someone on the street to define anxiety, they will describe a physiological feeling. A tight chest, racing thoughts, sweaty palms, insomnia. But Noack doesn't care about the feeling, does he? He cares about the architecture.
Yes. He defines anxiety structurally as a maladaptive control state. It is the procedural mode by which lower-level needs, like the biological need for food, or the sociological need for clothing and status stage a mutiny. They attempt to seize top-level control of the human mind. The lower levels try to drive the entire ship.
That reframing is incredible. It perfectly describes the experience of panic. It's when the need to pay your electric bill or fix your car completely overrides your sense of identity, your relationships, your morals, your peace. The electric bill basically takes the wheel. And this is where Noack does something fascinating in the exhibit. In Table 1, he takes Abraham Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs, that pyramid we all learned about in Psych 101, with physiological needs at the bottom and self-actualization at the top, and he applies what he calls the Mathian change proposal to it. It is literally as if Matthew chapter 6 is a software patch updating Maslow's baseline human code.
It's a brilliant structural comparison because it shows exactly what Jesus is and isn't changing. Let's look at the base of the pyramid, the physiological level.
Wow.
In Maslow's baseline, food, drink, and clothing are paramount. They dictate survival. In the Mathian modification, are those needs deleted?
No. Jesus explicitly says, your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. He completely acknowledges that we are meat sacks that require calories and fabric to survive the winter.
Precisely. The needs are acknowledged as completely real. But the priority logic changes. The patch dictates that they are not allowed to become the master. The requirement remains, but its governance over the human soul is aggressively demoted.
Okay, so then we'll move up Maslow's pyramid to safety needs. Maslow talks about threat management, storing resources, planning for the future. In the broader context of Matthew, Jesus talks about people stockpiling grain into barns to secure their future. But Noack points out that the modification here is that anxiety is explicitly prescribed. It is outright forbidden as the governing procedure for safety.
Right, you can plan, you can sow, you can reap, but you cannot let worry dictate the plan. It's an administrative control applied to how you respond to risk. Next up the pyramid is esteem and status. Maslow recognizes that visible adequacy, splendor, and comparison to others are core human drives. We want to look successful. How does the Mathian patch address this?
It completely dismantles it. Jesus points to King Solomon. And for a first-century audience, Solomon is the absolute pinnacle of wealth, power, and status. The guy had unimaginable splendor. But Jesus says, not even Solomon in all his splendor was clothed like one of these lilies. He points to a totally unremarkable temporary weed in a field and says, that is the authorized counterimage. Status and visible splendor are effectively derated. They are removed as authorized top-level requirements for the human operating system, which leaves a vacuum at the top of the pyramid. Now, Noack points out a great piece of historical trivia here. Later in his life, Abraham Maslow actually realized his pyramid was incomplete. He added a sixth level above self-actualization, which he called self-transcendence. I didn't know that until I read this exhibit. It always gets left out of the textbook diagrams, but it changes the whole trajectory of Maslow's thought. You don't just actualize yourself. You have to connect to something beyond yourself.
And that is exactly where the Mathian patch installs its brand new top-level requirement. Jesus says, seek first the kingdom and his righteousness. That becomes the ultimate directive. It is installed directly above all baseline survival anxiety. The kingdom is supposed to act as the new executive control center.
I hear what you're saying, and the architecture makes logical sense on paper. But as a human being living in the world, I have a massive glaring problem with this. If my biology biologically forces me to be hungry, and the society I live in forces me to pay for that food through exhausting labor, how much of my anxiety is actually up to me? You're telling me I have to install this kingdom patch, but my hardware is screaming for calories.
That is the exact agonizing tension Noack is highlighting. What is up to the human is actually severely limited. You do not choose the hunger pangs. You do not choose the external threat of a corporate layoff. But according to the Mathian framework, what you can partially govern is your attention, your internal speech, your habituated reactions, and your allegiance. Matthew 6 modifies the governance, but it does absolutely nothing to change the substrate. You still have to eat. You just are commanded not to worship the food or the brutal means of acquiring it.
Oh, wait, this brings us to an enormous theological contradiction, a massive flaw in the system that Noack calls the Genesis bug. Because if we transition from how the human system is currently designed to how the system got broken in the first place, the biblical text actually implicates itself.
This raises an important question. And this is where Nowak's critique gets incredibly sharp and, frankly, a bit dangerous. He points out a major internal collision within the narrative of the Bible itself. He forces us to look back at Genesis chapter 3, the story of the fall of Adam and Eve. After they disobey, God sentences them. And what specifically is the sentence?
The sentence is a complete degradation of the human environment. It's intensified toil, physical pain, cursed ground, frustrated labor, and the introduction of mortality. God literally says, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground." That is God, the manufacturer, actively installing scarcity and death into the human operating system.
Exactly. If the divine economy itself, the very structure of the post-fall world authored by God, deepened and magnified the conditions of anxious existence by introducing intense scarcity and sweat, how can that same divine economy later in the timeline through the person of Jesus suddenly forbid anxiety as a response to those exact conditions?
Here's where it gets really interesting, right? Because if God cursed the ground to make food incredibly hard to get, commanding humans not to worry about food feels completely hypocritical. It almost feels like victim blaming. Is anxiety actually a defect in the human machine, or is it a perfectly rational, logical, necessary output of a scarcity-structured, fallen human condition? If God installed the scarcity patch back in Genesis, then Jesus' command to not be anxious, Matthew functions as a late normative patch, not a full causal redesign.
Your frustration is exactly what Nowak is isolating. The text creates a forensic paradox.
Yeah, it's like the manufacturer of a car selling you a vehicle with a fundamentally broken engine. The engine is misfiring, it's shaking, it's overheating, the check engine light is flashing red on the dashboard. And instead of calling the car and replacing the broken engine, the manufacturer just tapes a piece of paper over the check engine light that says, "Do not let this light divide your attention. Focus on the road."
That analogy is devastatingly accurate to Nowak's forensic question. Is the defect in our evolutionary biology an original sin? In our sociological systems, it almost doesn't matter, because the material and existential drivers of anxiety, hunger, cold, death are not revoked by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. The command not to worry is an incredible, almost impossible procedural demand placed on a system that is still structurally, physically designed to experience the trauma of scarcity.
So how on earth is a human supposed to execute this command?
Yeah.
To understand the actual mechanics of this demand, Nowak takes us deep into the language of the text itself, specifically the original ancient Greek, and he builds this amazing analytical matrix in Table 2 that honestly blew my mind.
Yes, let's look at the controlling verb Jesus uses in the passage. In Greek, it sounds something like me merimnate. Most English Bibles translate this as "do not be anxious" or "take no thought." But Nowak points out that the root of this Greek word implies a division. It means to be drawn in different directions, to be distracted. So a more accurate structural translation is, "do not let care divide and govern you." And Jesus repeats this command like a relentless drumbeat. Verse 25, "Do not let anxiety govern your life." Verse 31, "Do not enter into anxiety by obsessing over what you will eat." Verse 34, "Do not become anxious about tomorrow."
It's not a gentle suggestion. It is a strict, unyielding imperative. And this is where Nowak does something completely out of left field, but it works so perfectly. To evaluate the effectiveness of this relentless command, he doesn't use theology. He uses Australian industrial risk management frameworks. Specifically, the hierarchy of risk controls promulgated by SafeWork Australia.
I know, it sounds absurd at first.
Totally absurd. Like, wait, Australian workplace safety?
Right. But it is a stroke of absolute genius. By subjecting this highly spiritual, poetic text to the cold, hard logic of industrial workplace safety, you expose exactly what the text is actually doing. In risk management, if you have a hazard on a factory floor, there is a strict hierarchy of how you deal with it, from the most effective method to the least effective.
Okay, let's walk through Table 2 and evaluate Jesus as a factory safety manager. The top tier, the absolute most effective way to deal with a workplace hazard is hazard elimination, or engineering redesign. You just remove the dangerous thing entirely, or you redesign the machine so it can't hurt anyone. How does Jesus' intervention score here?
It scores incredibly low, almost a 0. Jesus does not eliminate food insecurity from the world. He does not re-engineer human biology so that we no longer need to consume calories. He doesn't cancel human mortality. The hazard is still fully present and operational on the factory floor.
Right. To use a factory analogy, let's say the hazard is a massive spinning buzzsaw right next to your workstation. That buzzsaw represents starvation, eviction, and death. Hazard elimination would be unplugging the buzzsaw and taking it out of the room. Jesus does not do that. The saw is still spinning right next to your arm. Okay, the next level down in safety effectiveness is administrative or procedural control. This is where you can't remove the saw, so you put up a bright yellow sign that says, "Do not touch the spinning buzzsaw. Maintain a 3-foot distance." How does the text score here?
It scores moderately. Jesus' commands are heavily, almost entirely administrative. Do not be anxious, look at the birds, learn from the lilies, seek first the kingdom. These are all cognitive and procedural reframings. They depend 100% on human compliance, mental vigilance, and changing how the worker perceives the threat.
But the problem with procedural controls is that humans get tired. If you work next to a buzzsaw for 40 years, eventually you might slip, or get distracted, or just get so exhausted by the noise that you make a mistake. Administrative controls don't stop the saw from cutting you if you fall.
Exactly. Which leads us to the next tier, which is residual risk acceptance. Does the safety protocol acknowledge that despite the signs and the procedures, the environment is still fundamentally dangerous?
It does. And this is where I think the text scores highly on realism. Look at the very end of the passage, verse 34. Each day already carries enough trouble of its own. Or as some of the older translations put it, sufficient for the day is its own evil. Jesus does not gaslight the listener. He doesn't pretend the world is a safe, fluffy place. He explicitly accepts that the residual risk, the daily grinding burden of survival, is heavy and evil.
Which leaves us with the final and undoubtedly the most unique control mechanism in the Matthean text, which is third-party assurance.
This is the crux of the entire system, isn't it?
It really is. The entire administrative apparatus completely collapses unless you introduce a new active agent into the equation, God the Father. The text explicitly states that your Heavenly Father knows you need these things. It claims He is the one who feeds the birds, He is the one who clothes the grass, and therefore He will add these things to you if you seek the kingdom first.
Theologically, if you are a believer, that score is very high. But as Nowak points out with devastating clarity, empirically, it is incredibly difficult to audit.
Let's go back to our factory. You are working next to the exposed, spinning buzzsaw of mortality and starvation. The procedural control is a sign saying, do not let anxiety govern you. But the ultimate mitigation, your only real safety net, is someone pointing to an unseen off-site CEO, the Father, and saying, trust him, he is monitoring the security cameras, he knows you need to keep your arm, he won't let the saw kill you today.
I mean, I have to ask you, and I ask the listener, how comfortable would you be relying on that specific kind of safety protocol in real life when the rent is actually due?
Yeah, it requires an absolute radical transfer of trust. It demands that your sense of assurance rests entirely on divine, invisible agency rather than ordinary, verifiable engineering controls. You can't look at your bank account to feel safe. You have to look at the unseen Father. And that is why Nowak insists this is fundamentally an intervention of allegiance. You are choosing to trust the third-party assurance agent over the screaming, deafening evidence of the spinning saw right next to you.
But humans are practical creatures. We haven't just been sitting around for 2,000 years waiting for the unseen CEO to turn off the saw. We have spent the last century and a half developing entirely different secular methods for dealing with the crippling anxiety of that skinning blade. Which brings us to Nowak's comparative matrix of maintenance. He actually sets Jesus' ancient maintenance regime up against two massive giants of modern psychology, Sigmund Freud and Viktor Frankl.
Yeah, Table 3 in the exhibit is a fascinating piece of forensic mapping. Nowak compares these three regimes, psychoanalysis, logotherapy, and the Matthian critical intervention, across several specific vectors, like what do they diagnose as the primary problem, what is their method of repair, what is the role of the guide, and what are their inherent limits.
I want to break these down because it really clarifies how bizarre Jesus' method is compared to how we treat anxiety today. Let's start with Freud and psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
If a guy walks into a therapist's office having a panic attack about losing his job and starving, how does Freud view the defect?
So Freud would say the anxiety about the job is likely a symptom of a deeper hidden issue. Psychoanalysis views the primary problem as unconscious conflict, repression, or unresolved early childhood trauma. The fear of the boss might actually be a repressed fear of the father figure. The method of repair is free association, listening, interpreting dreams, basically unearthing the past.
And the guide in this scenario is the interpreting analyst. The therapist sits there, listens, and helps the patient connect the dots. The ultimate goal is simply to bring the unconscious causes into conscious awareness. The theory being that once you understand why you are terrified of the buzzsaw, the terror loses its grip on you.
But Nowak explicitly notes the limit here. Psychoanalysis can endlessly overinterpret the psyche and human desire. You can spend 10 years on a couch dissecting your relationship with your mother, but it doesn't change the external material reality. The buzzsaw is still spinning. You still don't have a job. You just have a very articulate understanding of why being unemployed makes you feel like a disappointed child.
Right. Okay, so if Freud looks backward into the unconscious, what about Viktor Frankl and logotherapy? Just for context for the listener, Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps, and he wrote the incredible book Man's Search for Meaning. He developed logotherapy based on his experience in the absolute worst, most hazardous environment imaginable.
Frankl's approach is radically different from Freud's. For Frankl, distress isn't just repressed childhood conflict. It is a profound sense of meaninglessness. He called it the existential vacuum. When you are suffering, the suffering destroys you if it has no purpose. So the method of logotherapy is dialogue, helping the patient discover responsibility and finding a specific, personal meaning even in the midst of unavoidable suffering.
The guide here is a meaning-oriented facilitator, and the goal is to orient the person toward a future purpose. It's the famous Nietzsche quote Frankl used, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." You survive the buzzsaw by deciding that dodging the blade is essential so you can write your book or raise your child or help your fellow workers.
It is incredibly powerful, but Nowak is objective, and he points out the limit for Frankl's therapy too. Logotherapy might overestimate human freedom under severe, absolute material constraints. You can find meaning in the pain of starvation, and it might preserve your psychological dignity, but finding meaning does not put biological calories into your body. Meaning doesn't stop biological death.
So, with Freud looking backward to the unconscious and Frankl looking forward to future meaning, how does Jesus Christ's therapy stack up in this matrix? How does the ancient text try to fix the anxious worker?
Nowak shows that Jesus' approach is structurally entirely distinct. The primary problem isn't the unconscious past, and it isn't an existential vacuum in the future. The problem is present, active, divided allegiance. It is the act of serving mammon. The method isn't a dialogue. Jesus isn't asking the listener how they feel about the lilies. The method is authoritative prescription, a direct command of do not, coupled with divine assurance.
Right. The guide isn't a facilitator holding a clipboard or an analyst taking notes. The guide is an authoritative prescriber. He is issuing royal commands. He is reprogramming the executive function of the brain by fiat.
Exactly. And the view of anxiety itself is completely different. For Freud, anxiety is an interesting symptom to be decoded. For Frankl, it's a sign of a misdirected stance toward life's meaning. But for Jesus, anxiety is explicitly prohibited as a master procedure. It is an unauthorized, malicious program running on the hardware. What has to change is the priority hierarchy. The kingdom must be placed in the executive seat over mammon and over worry.
But I have to push back here because Jesus' therapy shares a massive limit with both Freud and Frankl. As we established with the SafeWork Australia Matrix, it does not remove the substrate hazards. Jesus demands an immediate, vertical realignment of authority, demoting the physical world of mammon and installing the divine kingdom. But the next morning, your biology still wakes you up needing bread. The rent is still due.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the inescapable friction. Freud analyzes the past. Frankl searches the future. Jesus demands a vertical, immediate obedience in the present. But none of these three regimes re-engineer the biological necessity of eating. The vulnerability remains.
And that profound, lingering vulnerability brings us to the most effective emotional part of Nowak's entire exhibit. Because he doesn't just leave this as a dry clinical systems analysis. He translates this terrifying theology into audiovisual effect. We move from these brilliant engineering tables to a second painting and an actual piece of recorded music. Let's talk about Figure 2.
Yeah, so Figure 2 is an allegorical painting titled Eve Today, Tempted by Tomorrow, an allegory of the anxious soul. And the visual is incredibly striking and tense. You see a woman representing the human soul, dressed in classical, flowing garments. She's standing on the edge of a jagged stone cliff. She is perched precariously. On the solid stone block right beside her, carved deeply into the rock, is the Latin word for today, spelled H-O-D-I-E.
And she isn't looking at the solid ground she's standing on. She's looking across a terrifying, hazy, seemingly bottomless chasm. And on the opposite cliff face, barely visible through the mist, is another word carved into the stone. The Latin word for tomorrow, spelled C-R-A-S.
That chasm perfectly physically captures the psychological gap between what we possess right now, today, and the sheer terror of what might happen to us tomorrow. She is leaning out over the abyss, tempted to throw her attention, her energy, and her anxiety into a future space that she cannot actually reach or control.
It is a stunning visual representation of verse 34. Do not become anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. But to accompany this painting, the exhibit includes an existential chant, simply titled, Not Tomorrow. And Nowak actually includes the production brief for this music in Table 4. When I read this table, I was floored by how specific and demanding it is. It's almost startling.
The musical parameters are incredibly strict because the music has to embody the theology. It mandates a slow pulse, specifically 58 to 66 beats per minute, which mimics a resting, albeit cautious, human heart rate. It has to be in a modal minor or Dorian scale, which inherently sounds unresolved and searching. The instrumentation is incredibly sparse, just a distant nylon string guitar, maybe a subtle electric bass reverb to give it depth.
And the emotional mood is explicitly, ruthlessly defined. Intimate, nocturnal, fragile, human. And crucially, Nowak demands in bold letters that the chant be neither preachy nor triumphant. The vocal delivery must be pure, no distortion, no harsh reverb, and absolutely no synthetic choir wobble, as he puts it.
That specific rejection of synthetic enhancement is key. It ensures a chant sounds bare, small, and vulnerable. Think about it. A triumphant, booming, major key choir would completely contradict the reality of the residual risk acceptance we talked about earlier. Triumphant music implies the hazard is gone. This music has to sound like a person singing quietly in the dark while the buzzsaw is still humming in the next room. It reflects the fragile reality of relying on an unseen assurance.
Let's look at the lyrics of this chant. It's incredibly brief, only 6 lines, but Nowak describes them as exegetically load-bearing. Every syllable is carrying immense theological weight. The lyrics are, do not let me fall into tomorrow. Do not let gold become my God. Bread, breath, today be enough.
It is a profound compression of the entire theology of Matthew 6. The opening plea, do not let me fall into tomorrow, directly tackles the visual of the Romans staring at tomorrow over the abyss. It takes the prohibition of verse 34 and renders it as a desperate clinging to the present moment.
And the phonetic wordplay in the next 2 lines is absolute genius. Do not let gold become my God. Gold and God. They are near homophones in English. They sound almost identical. And Nowak points out in his notes that this phonetic similarity isn't just a neat poetic trick. It illustrates the entire danger of the human control system.
Yes, the exhibit emphasizes that the single vowel distance between the word gold and the word God measures precisely how slight the swerve of misdirected allegiance really is. It takes almost no psychological effort to slip from trusting the divine provision to trusting the financial ledger. The idol of mammon is terrifyingly close to the idea of providence.
You literally barely have to move your mouth to change the word. Then we reach the final lines. Bread, breath, today be enough. Shifting the traditional biblical request for daily bread to the word breath is so deeply moving. It widens the plea from just asking for a sandwich to asking for the raw, baseline physiological gift of existence. Just let my lungs fill with air today. Let today's bare survival be sufficient.
But there is a critical structural psychological shift happening in these lyrics that we have to highlight. We spent a lot of time discussing how Jesus' words in Matthew are an imperative command, do not be anxious. He is ordering the human to act. But the chant entirely converts that top-down command into a bottom-up petition, do not let me fall, do not let gold become my God.
So the disciples speaking back to the text.
Exactly. The human subject is acknowledging their total inability to execute the procedure on their own. They are looking at the spinning saw, realizing their hands are shaking, and they are pleading with the third-party assurance agent, the unseen Father, for the very capacity to obey the command. It perfectly poignantly illustrates the absolute dependency built into the Matthean system. The chant does not resolve in a major key triumph. The final words, be enough, just fade out into silence, performing an actual sound, that lingering, unresolved, residual risk acceptance.
He comes to rest, but the danger is still out there waiting in the dark.
Okay, before we wrap up, let's pull all of this together. We need to summarize the forensic findings of this deep dive. What does this actually mean for you, the listener, navigating your own anxieties?
The core, inescapable takeaways from Nowak's exhibit are these. First, Matthew 6 is not a pastoral cancellation of human need. It is a rigid procedural and noetic override of how we process those needs. It demands a brand new executive hierarchy of control in your brain. Second, it does absolutely nothing to give you, the human, sovereignty over your biology, your economic environment, or your history. you are still completely subject to hunger, aging, and financial scarcity. The Christic intervention simply demands that those unavoidable terrors do not become your master.
And third, evaluating it as a risk management strategy, it is profound at the level of internal allegiance and virtue, but it is incredibly, terrifyingly weak at hazard elimination. It relies entirely, 100%, on whether the third-party assurance, the unseen father, is actually trusted to intervene and provide.
So what does this all mean? We started this journey with a familiar, comforting religious greeting card, the pastel birds and the gentle lilies. But by forcing it through the meat grinder of systems engineering and psychological matrices, we discovered a highly technical, aggressively demanding framework for managing the unavoidable, terrifying risks of being alive. The Sermon on the Mount isn't telling you the check engine light on your dashboard is broken. It's telling you to completely ignore the flashing red light, keep driving, and trust a mechanic you can't even see.
It leaves the physical, causal substrate of our anxiety largely intact, but demands a radical, almost violent shift in who we report that anxiety to.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering, and frankly haunting question to mull over, something that builds on everything we've unpacked today. The entire Mathian system requires absolute, total trust in that third-party assurance agent, while simultaneously acknowledging that the daily hazards, starvation, toil, and death remain entirely active on the factory floor. So what happens when the system fails?
Or, to be precise, what happens when it appears to fail from the limited perspective of the human operating system?
Right. What happens if today's trouble actually destroys you? If the rent isn't paid and you are evicted? If the illness isn't cured and it becomes terminal? If the terrifying tomorrow reaches across the chasm and completely shatters your today? Was the defect in your allegiance? Did you accidentally serve gold instead of God by one vowel? Or was the third-party assurance agent simply silent? Think about how you personally process the tomorrow in your own life when the today completely falls apart. Because when you step into the diagnostic landscape Noack has laid out, the waters are murky, the x-ray is broken, and that buzzsaw is still spinning right next to you.
And the only thing left to do, the only real agency you have, is to decide where to place your attention in the seconds before the blade hits.
Exactly. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Do not let me fall into tomorrow. Do not let gold become my God. Breath today be enough. Do not let me fall into tomorrow. Do not let gold become my God. Breath today be enough. Do not let me fall into tomorrow. Do not let gold become my God. Breath today be enough. Do not let me fall into tomorrow. Do not let gold become my God. Breath today be enough. Do not let me fall into tomorrow. Do not let gold today.